Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Flex podcast presented by Prize Picks. I'm your host, Samantha Previte. On today's very special episode of 21 Questions, I am so happy to be joined by a man who needs no introduction, but I will do my best. The GOAT, the godfather of fantasy football, Matthew Berry, who you can find all over ESPN on Fantasy Football Now, the Fantasy Focused Football Podcast, the Fantasy Show, Sports Center, and on the Fantasy Life app. And on Twitter at Matthew Berry TMR. Welcome to the Fantasy Flex, Matthew. How are you doing?
Samantha, it's good to be here. Happy to be here. You said it's a very special episode of 21 Questions. Are you and I going to go through a journey and then at the very end learn of an important life lesson? You know, like those after school specials that are as a very special episode of a TV show where the main character, it's usually goofiness, but something bad happens to the character and they learn a lesson, like, don't get into vans with strangers, that kind of thing.
I can only hope for that
Yeah.
kind of emotional journey for us, that we have an epiphany, we laugh, we cry, all of it. So
All right.
Thank you so much again. It's been so great to, interact with you on social media and even meet you in person. So this is going to be a lot of fun. So let us just jump into the first question. You have been playing fantasy since you were 14 years old. So
Yeah.
What do you remember the most about your first league?
Yeah, I'm old. Yeah, I know. That's a loaded way of saying you're being very nice. Field Yates would just say, like, hey, you played back, when you had to keep score on caves, on cave walls. No, so I have been playing since I was 14 years old. I was 14 years old, by the way, in 1984. So you guys can do your own math there. And what I remember about my very first fantasy league is it was a auction draft. It was we played by the book, which is to say the Rotisserie League baseball book, the book that came out in 1983 by the founding fathers, by Daniel Okren and Glenn Wagoner. And so it was a 10-team NL only auction style draft. I paid $37 for Tony Gwynn, who had an awesome year that year, but that was a little bit too much. I was stars and scrubs even back then. And I paid $22 for Mario Soto, who was okay that year. So that's what I remember about those, that my first fantasy football league was, my first fantasy league was my first two picks ever. And the fact that, and I've written about that league extensively, the Fat Dog League. I've written about it in my book and everything like that. But in essence, I was a 14-year-old kid and the rest of the league were a bunch of mid-20 to 40-year-old guys. And they just needed something, like it was this weird game. Like it was back then, this is how old I am. Back then, there was no such thing as personal computers. The internet hadn't been invented as well. So this was all done like pen and paper, and you had to keep score by hand. So, in fantasy sports, again, the book just came out in the winter of '83. So the spring of '84 was the first time fantasy baseball had really been done publicly. I've since met Dan Okrent, who tells me we were one of the first 50 late baseball leagues in the history of the world. Anyway, so that's the other thing I remember is just, it was weird being a 14-year-old kid, in a league with a bunch of adults, but they needed somebody. And one of the guys in the league was my tennis coach, and he knew that I was a sports nerd. And so that's how I got in the league.
That is a really cool story. I think a lot of us, including myself, forget that you were, at least at first, a fantasy baseball person, and you've done fantasy basketball and everything like that, because we all know you as the GOAT of fantasy football. But you've played fantasy with a lot of really cool people over this very long period of time. Are there any celebrities or athletes that you haven't had a chance to play with yet, but would love to?
Sure. So I'm going to divide that into two questions. Number one is just celebrities I would like to meet, because it's the only way I get to meet celebrities is through fantasy football, because it's not like they're like, who would be great at the Met Gala? Matthew Berry. Like that doesn't happen. It's like, who'd be great at our fantasy draft is Matthew Berry. Like that's how I weasel my way into a lot of celebrity situations is obviously through fantasy football. So, a celebrity that I've never met that I would like to meet, big Springsteen fan, never met him. I think George Clooney would be cool to meet. He strikes me as a very cool guy. Bradley Cooper strikes me as a very cool guy when I've heard him interviewed quite a bit. So I think that would be a lot of fun. Trying to think of who else. So those are people that I've never met so I wouldn't mind playing fantasy football with them. People that I know that play fantasy football that I've never or that I've met, but I don't really know. Like I've met LeBron once, but I met him once for like 30 seconds. But LeBron plays in a fantasy league. I know for a fact that he plays in a fantasy league. Like I think that would be very cool. Like I've met The Rock before, but he doesn't play fantasy. But that would be cool to be in a league with The Rock, I suppose. Let's see. I've never met Scarlett Johansson. I'm a big fan of Scarlett Johansson. I know a lot of obviously of the people in the MCU, but I don't know her. So whenever I've ever heard her interviewed, she seems really cool as well. So there's some people off the top of my head.
Something tells me that LeBron would be honored to play in an 06010 league, and I will have to call up Anna Wintour and get you an invite to the Met Gala.
Well, could you? That would be great. I would appreciate that. That would be awesome. I have to figure out what to wear. I've never met Tom Brady either. That would be cool. I think just to meet Brady. I'm very well aware of LeBron's league. I may or may not be secretly helping somebody in LeBron's league. I cannot confirm or deny that rumor, but I know for a fact LeBron plays. That's what I will say. I know for a stone cold fact that LeBron James plays in a very competitive fantasy football league.
That is a very cool intel.
Although it's slightly less competitive for him this year. I'll just say that.
Fair enough. All right. Name one player you just can't quit or you always find yourself making excuses for.
So like Austin Eckler is my fantasy ride or die. So I obviously can't quit him, but I don't need to make excuses for him because he's been absolutely crushing. That's a call that's worked out this year. I made a lot of excuses for Jalen Hurts in the preseason because people were like, completion percentage is awful, and and he can't throw, and blah, blah. And we're just like, listen, as we saw last night with Taysom Hill, you don't have to be able to throw to be a good fantasy quarterback. By the way, one of the points I made in the preseason was if you looked at Jalen Hurts' average depth of target, his ADOT, right? It was much, much larger than he was throwing deep. He was throwing the ball fairly deep downfield a lot, which is obviously always going to hurt completion percentage. He's not a dink and dunk guy, or certainly wasn't last year in the first 4 games. But Field Yates will give me grief on the podcast that we do together, the Fantasy Focus podcast, because I've been an Antonio Gibson defender this entire year. Field used his first round pick in our War Room League on Gibson, and he's just been bemoaning it all year long. But obviously off of a big game Monday night, I have less excuses to make for him. It's finally healthy again. But for a while there, I did stick to my guns all year long on Antonio Gibson, even though it looked pretty bad there for a while.
I totally get that. I am also a Jalen Hurts apologist as well. So yes, sometimes watching those games is a little painful, but he gets the job done a lot. Are you bull or bear on the 0 RB strategy?
Yeah, I'm neither. To be candid, I'm not. I'm not a zealot and on either side of that argument. I am a big proponent of insurance running backs, of upside running backs, middle. Every year I write my draft day manifesto, and I always talk about, I don't call it 0 RB, but for years I've talked about that theory that running backs come into the league more often than any other position because of the injury-prone nature of that position. And I always talk about the fact that fantasy football is a weekly game, that it's often, especially in the preseason, always talked about as a yearly game. And the stats that people quote are always like, he was running back 16 or he had 1,200 yards or whatever. They're always cumulative stats. But the truth is that it's actually a weekly game played over the course of a year, but that's an important distinction. So just for example, like just that it's happened within the last hour, okay? Doesn't look like Melvin Gordon's going to play. Doesn't look like J.D. McKissick's going to play. Does that mean all of a sudden Mike Boone has more value this week filling in for Melvin Gordon? Does Javonte Williams get all the run there? Still sorting that out. But we expect Wendell Smallwood and Curtis Samuel to get a little bit more run. There are players. Here's a good example: Devontae Booker. Devontae Booker has no value this week, but he was a top 15 running back for the month or so that Saquon Barkley was out. And every year there are always guys like that you don't necessarily need to start every week, but there will be periods of time where you start those running backs, right? And here, I'll back up one second. The idea is not just about having high upside players, but it's about knowing when to start those players, right? Because whatever, Deontay Harris had a big night Thursday night, but like who knew to start Deontay Harris? Taysom Hill, his first start. They've been spreading the ball around in that passing offense. Dallas's defense has been pretty good. And Deontay Harris had been fairly inconsistent so far this year as a receiver. He basically had one big play in junk time. But this week, we know to start Alexander Mattison because the 2 weeks in Dalvin Cook's been out, he's averaged 24.7 fantasy points. He's been a top 7 fantasy running back each of those 2 weeks. This week, we know to start Jamal Williams because DeAndre Swift is out. And so that's, I think, a part of zero RB, right, is piecing it together. But so I don't want to sit here and say, like, I always believe in that or that I don't believe in it, because I'm always a believer in best player available. And if you're draft blind, like, so I'm a believer in, like, not reaching for a running back if that's not the best value, just letting the draft come to you. So I'm sort of talked out about both sides of my mouth here, but I'm just like, I just think people that go into a draft saying, like, I'm not drafting a running back till round 5, zero RB is the way to go. Or people that I'm going with hero RB or anchor RB, which is I'm going to draft one in the first round and then ignore it for a while and try to grab a bunch of these Alexander Mattison, Jamal Williams, high upside backup types. Tony Pollard, another example. I'm not that guy, but I'm also not the guy that's like, got to take a running back and run. Let the draft come to you. So that's where I am there. But I do think it's important to know that when you're drafting your team, this is a draft question. When you're drafting your team, I think it's important to know that you are constructing a roster that doesn't have to start for you every single week. You're trying to give yourself multiple options. So that's where I would much rather in the mid to late rounds, I'd much rather a guy like Madison, a guy like Jamal Williams, that we know will have value or that we'll know when to start that player and that there is tremendous upside, that they could win you a week, as opposed to Nyheim Hines, who's 8 to 12 points every week, whatever. But Nyheim Hines is never going to win you a week. Or if he does win you a week, you'll never know when that week's coming, right? He just gets 2 fluky touchdowns.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think to your point about being flexible and being agile in the draft and sort of being open-minded about what you want to do in terms of strategy is more important than being rigid to one specific strategy. If you could change one setting in every league right now, what would it be?
No kickers. No kickers.
I love that.
Superflex is so much. It's so much fun, but especially no kickers. I prefer not to play defense either, especially because in one of my most important leagues, I played against the Dallas defense last night, and you're like, and last week in that same league, I played against the Bengals defense. You're like, so, but yeah, I just think there's so much variance in fantasy football, and that there's even more variance with kickers and defenses. My friend Linda at Lindellians on Twitter does kicker rankings, and she's very good. She contributes to the Matthew Berry Fantasy Life newsletter, which we're really proud of, and she does great work. But yes, if you're asking me, so because leagues do play with kickers, we're thrilled to have Linda and her contributions. But if it were up to me, I would ban kickers and defense, and I would just go super flex.
I love that. I do think it is a lot of randomness. Speaking of randomness that is kind of introduced into fantasy football, which NFL coach is most infuriating for fantasy?
Belichick. I think it's Belichick. There's a lot of options, Cliff Kingsbury being one of them. Any coach that's sort of dishonest with the media is up there. Coaches that, like Mike McCarthy, back when he, like, free Aaron Jones. But for me, I think it's Belichick, just because it's sort of hard to argue with it because he's so successful. But it does drive us crazy, the multiple use running backs, the fact that his defense is always so good. So whenever I got Kyle Pitts, they're facing New England. So he's going to shut down. If one of my best players is playing against him, he's likely going to get shut down. And then I never know which running back to start. And they spread the ball around on offense. So yes, I think it's Belichick.
I think that is the very obvious answer for sure. I have an anti-Patriots bias to start with, and it kind of works out for fantasy football. So speaking of infuriating things, what made you angrier? Alfred Morris not getting a single point back in October of 2018, or Cardinals Twitter trolling fantasy managers over Chase Edmonds scoring 3 touchdowns in October of 2019?
It's a great question. Both made me very angry. Both
epic rants, by the way. Super fun.
Thanks. Both those rants did like over 1 million views on social media. So people seem to they like it, or they love to hate it, or they're like, look at this crazy guy. It's a great question. Which one made me angrier? I'm gonna say Alfred Morris, just because it was personal, in the sense that, so I was actually in Scott Fishbowl. It was my first year ever playing Scott Fishbowl, and I had just had tremendous bad luck. And so that was the year. And for people that aren't aware, Scott Fishbowl was like this. It's now up to 2,000, but I think at that particular year it was like 1,200 people. So it's a massive tournament across the fantasy industry. It's a great event that raises money and awareness for charity. Scott does a great job with it every year. But there's a couple of challenges with it. Number one is the draft is done basically in the middle of July, really before training camp is open, before really there's a lot of news. And the second thing is that it's very public, so that everyone can see your team, everyone can see your roster. It's all out in the open. And there's been a lot of great things about sort of, my career and the platform that ESPN has provided me. But if there's a negative, it's that, people have a keen interest in everything that I do. I feel like I'm under a microscope at all times.
Heaviest around.
I don't want to, I'm not trying to brag here, but like, whatever, that's the reality. It really is that people pay attention to me in a way that they don't pay attention to other analysts in the industry. Literally last year, some guy that wasn't in my fishbowl league, but has 20,000 followers on Twitter, something like that, 15,000 followers on Twitter. So he's a fantasy analyst of some renown. And he was tweeting out oh, Matthew Berry took an hour and a half to draft his Scott Fishbowl. I'm like, yeah, I'm on TV. You know what I mean? Hell you want from me, dude? You know what I mean? We have an 8-hour time limit. It's a slow draft for people. And so I'm just somebody that's not in my league was going in to see the time of how long I took to draft, and so it's just, anyway, people get all up in my business. So anyway, as a result, so I'm in Scott Fishbowl for the first time. And so people are interested in that. I drafted Le'Veon Bell number 1 in that year. That was the year that Le'Veon Bell sat out the entire year. And my league was so slow. To this day, it's the second slowest draft in Scott Fishbowl history. Scott told me this. My league took so long to draft that, and I had planned on drafting James Conner as a backup. I'd looked at the Scott Fishbowl ADP, and he was going in the 20th round, James Conner was, because everyone expected Le'Veon Bell to have this huge workload. And I'm like, what, I'll just grab him in the 18th round. I'm literally going to, 2 rounds ahead of where he goes just to make sure I get him. Okay. But then our league is taking so long, and then Schefter finally tweets out, this is 2 weeks after the draft has started, but we're still drafting. One of the last leagues to finish drafting. Schefter tweets out, there's a chance he might hold out. And so, of course, the next guy that's drafting, we're in the 14th round, grabs James Conner, who ends up having a huge year there. So, okay. So now I'm struggling along. I did grab Christian McCaffrey in the 2nd round, even though everyone said that was too high. He obviously had a huge year that year. So I'm actually competing. I have a good team, but I keep losing every week. So I was 3rd in the league in points or something like that. But I had lost 5 in a row. Every week I had lost by a couple of points. And everyone's paying attention. Oh, how's Barry doing in Fishbowl and blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. So I'm really frustrated because I have this good team, but we're getting outscored. And if we just had Le'Veon Bell or James Conner, because if we just drafted normally, I would have had James Conner. So I'm all bitter up to begin with. And then I'm going into a Monday night game. Alfred Morris is starting running back of the San Francisco 49ers. I'm down by 0.7 points. So I literally need 1 point from Alfred Morris. The guy I'm playing is done. I have Alfred Morris. He's starting. Again, Fishbowl is very deep. Morris was the starting running back of the 49ers that year. And he had gotten something 15 touches the week before, all their red zone work. They're playing the Packers on Monday night. I'm he should be able to get 1 point. And he doesn't get 1 point, Samantha. He doesn't get 1 point. He doesn't even get that many snaps. All of a sudden, it becomes out of the blue. It becomes a Raheem Mostert game. Raheem Mostert, who hadn't been a thing yet. He'd been in special teams. But Alfred Morris gets 1 snap. He gets the carry. He actually gets a first down. And Scott Fishbowl scoring that year, you got a point for first down. So, okay, great. Boom. I win. 1 snap, 1 point. Holding. They're freaking holding on this damn thing. And so now the point comes off. Alfred Morris is never seen again. I lose this match by 0.7. All I needed was 1 point. 1 stupid point. And so it was, you can tell me, whatever, 5 years later, I'm still upset about this thing. It was incredibly frustrating. So as mad as I was at the Cardinals Twitter handle and Clint Kingsbury. I would say Alfred Morris made me the angriest, Samantha, because it was personal. It was like, it was ingrained to me, and it remains one of the most frustrating losses I've had in a 30-year career of playing fantasy sports. Watching that game, eating away because of where I was and because of all the attention that was on that league, and you're just like, I need one, all I needed was one stupid point from a starting running back, and I didn't get it.
Very, very tough. I think that's why people love these rants and gave you these millions of views, because it's so relatable, especially like when you are the king. People want to know that you are still super connected and care about fantasy as much as you still do. So that is a terrible story, but also a very funny story.
Well, no, thank you. And I appreciate that. And I will say, like, I know this isn't one of your questions, but I think this is maybe potentially helpful or interesting to people, which is that, like, yeah, like, I think my appeal, or at least one of my appeals, is that I think, like, I'm a fantasy player first. I'm not Nate Silver. I'm not some brilliant analytical mind that just sort of, decided to come down from the mountaintops and do everything. Like, I've always thought about this. Like, remember Huey Lewis and the News? You're much younger than I, but have you ever heard of the group Huey Lewis and the News?
I'm sorry,
so
I don't.
Upsetting. No, I know. I'm an old. You're a young. But anyway, Huey Lewis and the News was a very popular band in the 80s and 90s and had a number of hits. And anyway, I Want a New Drug, Heart of Rock and Roll, Power of Love. Any of these names ring a bell? No.
Sorry. I really don't know pop culture very well.
That may be it. Anyway, whatever. All right. So Samantha just made me feel 1,000 years old. But all right.
I'm so sorry.
So, that's okay. Anyway, the point is that this would be a better story if you knew who they were. But in essence, I remember reading an interview with Huey Lewis and the News, and they basically said, like, we think our appeal, like, we're like, listen, there are musicians that are better than us, there are songwriters that are better than us, but we think our appeal is, we're like a bar band that made it. We're like a good time, hard rocking, work our ass off kind of bar band that just happened to make it. And they had, they've sold a million albums. I mean, millions and millions of albums. They're well known to a group of people in a certain age range. And so I always sort of feel like that's kind of my appeal on some level, is that I'm a fantasy player who made it, right? Like, I try not to talk down to my audience. I try to talk with my audience, that I'm one of you. You are one of, we are all in this together kind of thing. We've all had those moments. And so, yes, that was a lot of the feedback I got on the Alfred Morris rant, which was completely spontaneous. It just sort of poured out of me. It was just like, we've all been there. So anyway, I always try to, like, sort of, like, I would just feel like I'm a fantasy player who made it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just like all of us. So.
Well, we all love that raw emotion that you have. Looking forward to the fantasy playoffs, could you name a player or two that's lesser known that you could see breaking out during the playoffs?
I mean, Javonte Williams is the obvious answer, but I feel like he's not lesser known. A lesser known player that could break out. All right, I'll give you a couple of ideas here. I do think DeAndre Carter of my Washington football team is sort of interesting. They're using him a lot. Be interesting to see what happens now that Curtis Samuel gets up to speed. But I know they like DeAndre Carter a lot, and so he's sort of doing the role that I think we expected Diami Brown to have in the preseason. Washington sort of has a winnable schedule down the stretch. They're going to play Philadelphia twice, they're going to play Dallas twice, which are good secondaries, but the expectation there is that they're going to focus on Logan Thomas and Terry McLaurin, of course. So DeAndre Carter is kind of interesting to me down the stretch. I mean, again, these are well known, but I was impressed with Dontrell Hilliard and Deontay Foreman for the Titans. They're obviously on a bye this week, but I think you will see both those guys. Foreman played no more snaps. Hilliard had the one big play, but they like Hilliard a lot. So those are two guys that I think are lesser known that'll be interesting as we move forward in the playoffs. And also, one last one I'll just try to give you. How about Gabriel Davis? Emmanuel Sanders, older player. His production has slowed down. They go 4 wide a lot in Buffalo. Don't love the matchup, obviously, this weekend against the Patriots. But after that, I've always liked Gabe Davis as a player, just as a prospect. And so maybe he has some production. But it's hard to say that here's a guy that's going to make noise in the playoffs that is lesser known, because if they're lesser known, it's because they're not getting a lot of run, right? If Dalvin Cook's out for the playoffs, Alexander Mattison is going to make a huge difference. But I mean, do we qualify him as lesser known? I don't know. Here's one. It's because I feel like anyone that's listening to Samantha Previte's Action Network podcast isn't like, wait, Alexander Mattison, who's that? Like, I feel like it's, this is probably a deep dive audience. This is obviously probably a fairly smart and a well-informed audience. So it's hard to come up with a name of somebody that would be lesser known to that audience. I'll give you one other one that I think is interesting. Byron Pringle. I mentioned this on my podcast today. If you look at the last couple of games, Byron Pringle playing a lot more snaps, running a lot more routes than any non-Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce pass catcher in the Chiefs offense. It hasn't translated yet into big production. He does have double-digit fantasy points in 2 of the last 4. But Byron Pringle is somebody I think coming out of the bye is kind of an interesting name for deeper leagues.
Thank you so much for those. You did mention someone from your Washington football team. So I want to ask you, predict when you think the Washington football team will win their next Super Bowl.
Hopefully before I die. How about that? I don't know. I think we're headed in the right direction. I think there's still some flaws with the franchise. I certainly don't think it's going to be this year. But I'm impressed with what Coach Rivera has put together. We need a quarterback. Honestly, it's like, tell me when. Jury's still out on Heineke, and I like Heineke, but my guess is Heineke's probably like a really good backup. And I don't say this any disrespect, but like a Case Keenum. Case Keenum's a really good backup quarterback. Colt McCoy's like a really good backup quarterback, can come in and run the offense and do a good job. I'm hoping, listen, he hasn't gotten a lot of reps, so I would love it if Heineke became the guy. I'm not sure he is yet. I don't think Washington's sure he is yet, but so that's the thing. I do think Washington will be in the mix for Russell Wilson this offseason. I will say that. I do think they will be in the mix. I don't think Russell Wilson plays for Seattle next year, and I do think Washington is one of the teams that'll be in the mix.
A lot of teams need quarterbacks, and this is such a lean class, so it's going to be interesting how free agency sort of shakes out. Hail to the football team.
Hail to the football team, especially because, by the way, Russell Wilson's going to change teams. Deshaun Watson's going to change teams. There's a chance that Tua changes teams here. Chance that Derek Carr changes teams. So it'll be really interesting to see. Chance, depending on how the season goes for the Niners and how they feel about Trey Lance, Chance Garoppolo changes teams. So anyway, it'll be an interesting offseason in the quarterback market.
Of course. So hail to the football team does not seem right to me. It just doesn't feel right. So what would you rename the football team to?
I actually like that. It's grown on me. I like the football team. I've also said this as sort of like Washington FC football club, right? Kind of a nod to our brethren overseas. So it's sort of like Washington FC. I don't think this will be one of them, but I kind of like. I know it's been pitched out there as like either the Washington Hogs or the Red Hogs or something like that, which I like that, because that's something that is uniquely Washington, meaning that franchise, and speaks to our history. Like some of the ones that have come up, like the Warriors or the Red Tails or the Red Wolves, you're sort of like just kind of a name picked out of a hat that doesn't have anything to do with the team and part of the history. So if they weren't going to go with football team or Washington FC, which I sort of like, I just like the classic nature of that. It's grown on me. I would go with, I preferably would like Hogs or Red Hogs or something like that to harken back to the days of yore, the glory days, the Gibbs days.
Awesome. We probably won't see another Cordarrelle Patterson type breakout next year, but give us one name that you think of a player who could have a really big breakout season next year.
Yeah, I should just go back to see who else I promoted like 8 years ago, because I was all in on Cordarrelle Patterson, but it was like 8 years ago, Samantha. And then, I was just 8 years too early. So here's my question. Let me ask you back a question. When you say a Cordarrelle Patterson-like breakout, are you saying that somebody that just sort of comes out of nowhere to have a monster season, or are you saying kind of an older player that was forgotten that finds himself in a new role on a new team? Because that's the thing. What's so shocking about Patterson is he's 30 years old. It's his 8th NFL season. It's like his 4th or 5th NFL team. And so all of a sudden, like, out of the blue, the guy's a top 10 fantasy running back after spending most of his career as a wide receiver. So, it's a weird story all the way around.
Yeah, I would say more of the former, just someone that kind of comes out of nowhere. It doesn't have to be a specific situation change like that.
We've only seen flashes, but Kadarius Toney is really interesting. Right? I think that's a really talented player. We just had the Thursday night game, so it's in my mind, but we talked about this podcast. Michael Gallup's a free agent after this year. And given how much money the Cowboys have and Zeke and Dak, and they're going to want to re-sign CeeDee Lamb at some point soon, and like they've got Michael Gallup's likely moving on. You never know, but there's a chance that Michael Gallup plays, especially because they've gotten some nice production out of Cedric Wilson and Noah Brown. Like they have some depth behind Gallup. Gallup's really, really talented. So that's a guy that's going to go from like a wide receiver 4 to potentially a top 15 guy next year. So I think Michael Gallup is really interesting as well. And I'll give you one that to give you a Cordarrelle Patterson, sort of a guy that is, an older player, if you will. I sort of think David Johnson in the right situation, if they use him as a pass catcher more than like as a between the tackles guy, if it was a better offense with a good quarterback and a coordinator that knew how to use him, I could see David Johnson having, one more run at fantasy glory.
Love to see it. Which NFL Combine event would you excel at? And do you think you could beat Darren Rovell in the 40-yard dash?
That's a good question. I've met Darren. I'm taller than him, but I think we're about the same weight. I might have a few pounds on him. I don't know how fast he is. I don't think he's a particularly good athlete from the videos I've seen. I was a good athlete, but I'm also old. And I'm probably about 10 years older than Darren. I don't know how old Darren is. My guess is Darren's like in his mid-40s. So I'm like, whatever. I'm like 5 years older than him. Could I beat him in a 40-yard dash? Sure. I'll say that I can. I don't know that I can, but sure. I'll say that I can. I would want.
In which event would you be best at? Broad jump, the 3-cone drill, shuttle, bench press, anything like that?
I mean, is there a beer chugging part of the combine? Like, is there like getting drunk at St. Elmo's at 3 a.m. that event at the combine? Like I'm pretty good at that. That's the one I would say. I would say that one. I would say getting drunk with the NFL personnel at St. Elmo's or Prime. Like 2, 3 in the morning during combine week. That's the one I excel at the most. Let's see, of the actual combine ones, I guess the jump. I can. That would be the up. I don't know that I would excel at it. I'm just saying I would be better at the jump than all the other stuff. That I would suck less at that than I would suck at all the other stuff. How about that?
That is the key, just sucking less at certain things.
Less. Well, we made this joke on the podcast where we're like, how like Notre Dame has the, play like a champion today for like a year and a half when we were in our old studio, because I joked about that we needed this. And then somebody actually sent in a sign. So we did it. We had a sign above the studio that me and Field and actually Nate, it was back in the Nate days. We would touch the sign on our way in that just said, "Don't suck today." So it's not play like a champion today, but just don't suck today. So yeah, suck less, don't suck today. All those words of encouragement.
On the topic of athletic abilities, how many attempts would it take you to make an extra point?
I'm actually not a bad kicker. We've done this before. The Fantasy Football Marathon, we actually set up goalposts, and I had a kicking competition with Tim Hasselbeck, who was a former NFL player, and I beat him. And I made it sooner than he did. So how many attempts? I'm going to say I would set the line at 10 and I would take the under. How about that? I think I could do it in less than 10.
That is very impressive. They are making a movie about the talented Mr. Roto. Which actor would you want to portray you, and who makes a surprise cameo in this movie?
Let's see, who plays me? I mean, probably Ryan Reynolds or The Rock, I feel like. No, who plays me? I mean, the Clooney's like the obvious answer. You'd love Clooney to play you, right? But I think actually to give you a genuine answer, to give you not a jokey answer in terms of some really good looking leading man. I actually think Woody Harrelson. We are both follically challenged. I think Woody Harrelson's like a really good actor. I think he's very funny, but I also think he can play dramatic. And so I think if you were to actually decide to do the story of my life, which no one would ever do, but if you ever decide to do the story of my life, I think he would be able to hit. There's some comedy and there's also some tragedy in my life, and so yeah, I'd say Woody Harrelson would actually be a good choice in terms of an actual movie star that sort of looks like me a little bit, you know, in the movie star version of me could be. So yeah, I'll say Woody Harrelson.
Okay, fair enough. If you
what do you think?
feel...
Who would you cast for me?
Oh, of course, George Clooney. That's just the obvious answer.
You.
If you, Field Yates, Adam Schefter, Mike Clay, and Stephania Bell were all dropped into a Hunger Games-esque simulation, who would be the victor?
Me. I would be the victor. Now, let's break this down. Schefter and Field are both more athletic than I am. Fine. Stephania and Mike are both smarter than I am. But all four of them are very ethical people, and they are all incredibly above board ethical people. Listen, I like to think I am, but when death is on the line, I'm not playing that way. So if you ask me, like, I feel like I have that killer instinct that they wouldn't have. So I feel like I would be more conniving than they. I would pit them against each other. Stephania, as people get injured, and Stephania would be busy trying to heal them with berries, and whatever, cover their wounds with blades of grass, and then I would come up behind her and boom, all right, there, Stephania's done. Mike would just be like buried in his buried like in his notebook, like trying to calculate the stats and the angle of the attitude and altitude of like where to shoot his bow and arrow or something like that. He'd be crunching all sorts of numbers, and I'd just come up to behind him and just smack him, and boom, okay, so that's done. Field would probably be distracted because he'd be like, oh man, the leaves just changed and they suddenly don't match my jacket, and so now Field's like worried about what he's going to look like. So he's worried about the fashion, and he's probably wearing clothes that look good but aren't functional for a wooded environment. So boom, then he's done. And then Schefter's the easiest because Schefter just be looking down at his phone the whole time, tweeting, and you're just like, all right, boom, I'm going to come behind you, and boom, 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 all right, done. So I think it's me when you sort of think about, how that all plays out. I think a better question is who finishes second, and who finishes second. And I'm going to say, I'll say Mike Clay finishes second.
Fair enough.
I would kill Mike last, is what I would do.
All right. I know we are a little over time here, and I want to be respectful of your valuable time. Was Joe Flacco ever elite? Yes or no?
No.
Not even for a brief period of time?
Elite at what? Or just was he elite?
Was he elite?
Was he elite? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no, Joe Flacco was not elite. I would say Joe Flacco had a really good month at the office. Sometimes you have a good day at the office. He had a really good month at the office. But I'm going to say, was he elite? No, he was not elite. And I will also say that I would rather face one horse-sized Joe Flacco than 100 duck-sized Joe Flacco's. Right? Isn't that it's the horse versus 100 ducks? Like, because that's the other Reddit question, right? Isn't something like that? It's some version of that, right?
I have never heard this question set up, so
it's something like that. It's and I'm butchering it. I'm sure. Somebody will tell me on social media, but I feel like that's the question that always gets asked a lot. But there's like, would you rather face like what a horse size or 100 duck? Anyway, whatever. It's a weird question like that. And so I'm answering a horse. All right.
Okay. Definitely not elite.
Yeah. Definitely elite.
Who is on your all-time fantasy Mount Rushmore?
LaDainian Tomlinson is an obvious one. Got to put Randy Moss up there. Peyton Manning. I would put Peyton Manning up there, and I'll put Gronk. I mean, Gronk. When Gronk was rolling, Gronk was Gronk was elite. So there you go. That would be my fantasy Mount Rushmore. And you make arguments for, Breeze or Brady at quarterback. You could make arguments for, I don't think you can make an argument for another running back other than Tomlinson there, but Jerry Rice would be on the list, obviously, for wide receiver. Antonio Gates, Tony Gonzalez at tight end, Jimmy Graham. Oh, Jimmy Graham might be tough to sleep off. I'm gonna go with Gronk. He's gonna be more fun at the party.
Definitely more fun at the party. All right. What was your biggest swing and a miss this season?
Oh gosh, I should have quit while I was ahead. Here's one. I'll give you one. I was lower than I should have been on Jonathan Taylor, just because I was nervous about no Quentin Nelson, no Carson Wentz, so Jonathan Taylor, I think would probably be, because I had him ranked as a low end RB1. I think I had him ranked in the 10 to 12 range. And, so, he's been just so incredibly dominant there. So that would be a pretty big one. Oh, and Russell Wilson. I was all in on Russell Wilson. I loved Russell Wilson coming into this year. I thought Shane Waldron was going to bring this really up-tempo offense, and it looked good early on, but obviously it's been brutal.
Definitely.
So,
Definitely been brutal. On the topic of Jonathan Taylor, are we just ready to crown him the undisputed 101 of drafts next year? And if not, who else is in that conversation?
I think if you're drafting today for next year, I think he's the 101. I think it was a conversation with McCaffrey prior to the second injury. I think that's no longer in the mix. And so I think probably, although given all the injuries to big name running backs, I think the argument is still, Devontae Adams, depending if him and Rodgers are playing together. Perhaps somebody safer, right? Like whether it's Kelsey or Devontae Adams. But yes, I think if you had a draft for next year today, Jonathan Taylor goes 101.
Has 2021 been the most surprising or unpredictable NFL/fantasy season of all time? I feel like we have had some crazy, crazy upsets. And I don't know if it's because media has less access to practices, that we're like a little bit less informed, or just like COVID kind of introducing some randomness into things. But do you feel like this has been the most unpredictable season of all time?
Yeah, I really do. And it's not just all that. And it's also because it doesn't feel like, the Cardinals have been rolling great, but it doesn't feel like there's a dominant team where you're like, well, we're all chasing those guys, right? Every single team, Buffalo's great, and they can't beat Jacksonville. We're like, well, Tennessee, they're world beaters, and they lose the Jets. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just, Tampa Bay, what's good? Tampa Bay is repeating. They lose to my Washington football team. Like, Patrick Mahomes, since week 7, Patrick Mahomes is the 19th best quarterback in fantasy. Patrick Mahomes is the 19th best quarterback in fantasy on a points per game basis since week 7. Like, we're in week 13. So it's crazy. And then also, just by the way, all these, like, what I call fantasy zombies, Mark Ingram, Cordarrelle Patterson, Devontae Freeman, like all these guys, like, wait, we left you for dead. And now all of a sudden you're fantasy relevant. Like, there's just a lot of people from, from 5 years ago that are suddenly becoming fantasy relevant. So yes, it is the weirdest year I can remember.
All right. Finally, if you had one cardinal rule to tell someone just getting into fantasy this year, what would it be?
Have fun. Look, here's the thing. It is more fun to win. And so many of the analysts and websites that you read and be like, we're going to help you crush your draft and dominate your opponent. And you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And I'm like, I get it, but it's something we do for fun. And people like argue on message boards and they're yelling at each other and they're accusing. And I've seen families break up and friendships break up and issues at work. And it's just like, it's a hobby. It's a game. It's a game we play for fun. And it's a game we play for fun that we have no ultimate control over. And that it's a game that's played with an oblong shaped ball made of leather. Weird crap's going to happen. Weird, unpredictable crap's going to happen. So you make the best guess you can. You say, I think this is going to happen. I think this is why it's going to happen. And you let the chips fall where they may. And hopefully they fall in your favor more often than they don't. But it's a game we play for fun. So that is, if someone who's just getting into fantasy football, that would be my first piece of advice, is just go in with the attitude of like, this is fun. You're going to go into this to have fun.
That is super, super important to remember. There are people that were asking me, should I kick this person out of my league? Should I now speak to them because they're starting Taysom Hill at tight end last year or some things like that?
Right.
That I'm just like, you're taking this way, way, way too seriously. So yeah, very, very important to have fun out there. All right, that'll do it for this round of 21 questions with our esteemed guest, Matthew Berry. Matthew, my boss, Chad Milliman, also wanted me to tell you that he says hi. I can't thank you enough for
Chad. He's the best. I love Chad. Chad and I worked together at ESPN for many years. Chad is the absolute best. Love Chad.
Absolute great guy. I can't thank you enough for joining me during this insanely busy time. Please remind everyone where they can find you during this NFL season and beyond.
Well, obviously ESPN, right? So we do the Fantasy Focus podcast every single day wherever you get podcasts. You can also stream it live on YouTube. You can read my column on ESPN.com every Thursday, my love-hate column. We do Fantasy Football Now every Sunday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern on ESPN2, except this week only, week 13, because of the college football playoff announcement show and some other stuff. We are streaming. We are only streaming this week. We are on ESPN's YouTube page, the ESPN Twitter handle, ESPN.com, the ESPN app, the ESPN Fantasy app. Basically, any digital platform or social platform where ESPN has a presence, you're able to watch Fantasy Football Now 10 a.m. till 12:30 this week, and this week only. Fantasy show streaming a couple times a week on ESPN Plus, and you can find me on social media where I am at Matthew Berry TMR on all forms of social media except the Fantasy Life app, which you mentioned, Samantha. I am merely at Matthew Berry on the Fantasy Life app, which is it's a great app. It's a free app. Highly recommend everyone check it out. There's a reason why we have 5 stars with thousands of reviews. It's a great tool and resource. It's a free app. Download it. If you hate it, delete it. But I promise you, you will love it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much again. Thanks to everyone for listening. Please rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts. Download us wherever you like to listen, and we will see you next time on the Fantasy Flex presented by Prize Picks. Peace out, y'all.